The stagecoach lurched to a halt in La Junta, Colorado, throwing Penelope Zimmerman forward in her seat hard enough that her carpetbag tumbled from her lap onto the dusty floor. She grabbed at the window frame to steady herself, her heart hammering not just from the abrupt stop, but from the reality of what she was about to do. Through the smudged glass, she could see the town spreading before her in the afternoon heat of August 1878. A collection of wooden buildings huddled along the railroad tracks that had brought prosperity to this corner of the Arkansas River Valley. She was here to marry a man she had never met, a railroad executive named Jonathan Whitmore, who had promised her father a comfortable life for his only daughter after corresponding for 6 months through carefully worded letters. Penelope stepped down from the coach, her traveling dress already clinging to her skin in the relentless heat. At 22 years old, she had thought herself prepared for this adventure, this leap into matrimony with a stranger. Her father's hardware store in St. Louis had fallen on difficult times, and when Mr. Whitmore's letters had arrived with their elegant script and promises of a fine house and security, it had seemed like divine providence. She smoothed her auburn hair, tucking the loose strands back into the neat bun at the nape of her neck, and looked around for someone who might be meeting her. The main street bustled with activity. Cowboys drove cattle through town toward the railroad pens, their shouts mixing with the whistle of a departing train. Women in calico dresses hurried along the wooden sidewalks, and men in suits stood outside the bank in serious conversation. Penelope felt suddenly very alone and very foolish. What kind of woman traveled halfway across the country to marry a man whose face she had seen only in a single daguerreotype, Miss Zimmerman? A voice spoke from behind her, and she turned to find a cowboy standing there, his hat in his hands. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of coffee. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed from hard work. Something about the way he looked at her made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. "Yes, I am Miss Zimmerman," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Name's Xavier Prescott, madam. Mr. Whitmore sent me to fetch you to the hotel. He said he would meet you there this evening for supper." Xavier's voice was low and gentle, with an accent that spoke of Texas origins. He reached for her carpetbag and the small trunk the driver was hauling down from the top of the coach. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Prescott," Penelope said, studying him more closely. There was something in his expression, a concern or worry that seemed out of place for a simple errand. Xavier loaded her belongings onto a wagon hitched nearby and helped her up onto the seat with a courtesy that surprised her. Most cowboys she had seen from the stagecoach window had been rough men, but this one moved with an easy grace and treated her like she was made of fine china. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, she noticed the way his jaw tensed, as if he was wrestling with something he wanted to say. They rode through town in silence for a moment, the wagon wheels creaking over the rutted street. Penelope watched the buildings pass, noting the saloons and gambling halls mixed in with the more respectable businesses. This was a railroad town, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where cattle were shipped east and supplies came west. "Miss Zimmerman," Xavier said suddenly, his voice tight, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you will not think me improper for speaking out of turn." Penelope turned to look at him, surprised by the urgency in his tone. "What is it?" Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read Grand Hotel, though the paint was peeling and the structure looked far from grand. He tied off the reins but did not move to help her down. Instead, he turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Madam, I have worked for Mr. Whitmore for 3 years now." I manage his cattle operation, or what is left of it. I feel I must tell you something before you make a mistake that cannot be undone." A cold feeling settled in Penelope's stomach despite the heat. "What do you mean?" "Jonathan Whitmore has no money of his own," Xavier said, the words coming out in a rush. "Everything he owns belongs to his uncle, Marcus Whitmore, who runs the railroad office here. Jonathan works for his uncle and lives in a house his uncle provides, but he does not have a dollar to his name that was not given to him. His uncle controls everything, and from what I have seen, Jonathan will never have anything of his own. His uncle is a hard man, madam, and he keeps Jonathan under his thumb. I think you should know this before you marry him." Penelope felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the wagon seat, her knuckles white. "Why are you telling me this? You work for him. You could lose your position." "I probably will," Xavier admitted, "but I could not let you walk into this blind. I have seen other men take advantage of women who had no one to tell them the truth, and I will not be party to it. You seem like a decent woman, Miss Zimmerman, and you deserve to know what you are getting into." The honesty in his eyes was undeniable, and Penelope found herself believing him instantly. She thought of her father, sick with worry over his failing business, pinning his hopes on this marriage. She thought of the letters from Jonathan Whitmore, filled with descriptions of his house and his prospects, never once mentioning that he was entirely dependent on his uncle's charity. "What should I do?" she whispered, not really meaning to say it aloud. Xavier's expression softened. "That is not for me to say, madam. I just thought you should have the truth. What you do with it is your choice." Before Penelope could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Prescott, what the hell are you doing standing around talking? Get her bags inside and get back to work." Penelope looked up to see a heavy-set man with silver hair and a thick mustache striding toward them. He wore an expensive suit that strained across his belly, and his face was red with what looked like permanent irritation. This had to be Marcus Whitmore. Xavier climbed down from the wagon immediately, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, sir, Mr. Whitmore. Just making sure Miss Zimmerman was comfortable after her long journey." Marcus Whitmore barely glanced at Xavier before turning his attention to Penelope. His eyes swept over her in a way that made her skin crawl, assessing her like livestock. "So you are the girl from St. Louis. My nephew has been talking about nothing else for weeks. Pretty enough, I suppose. Come inside, girl. We will get you settled." Penelope allowed Xavier to help her down from the wagon, acutely aware of the brief moment when his hand held hers, warm and steady. Then Marcus was ushering her toward the hotel, talking over his shoulder about wedding arrangements and his expectations for his nephew's wife. Inside the hotel lobby, which smelled of dust and old tobacco, Marcus finally stopped talking long enough for Penelope to gather her thoughts. "Jonathan will be here at 6 o'clock for supper," he said. "The wedding is set for Saturday morning, 3 days from now. I trust that is acceptable." "I would like to speak with Mr. Whitmore," Penelope said carefully. "Before the wedding." Of course. That is what tonight is for." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "Room 7 up the stairs. Prescott will bring your things. Supper is at 6 sharp. Do not be late." He left without waiting for a response, and Penelope found herself standing alone in the shabby lobby, her mind reeling. Xavier appeared a moment later with her trunk on his shoulder and her carpet bag in his other hand. His eyes met hers, questioning, concerned. "Room 7, she said quietly, and led the way up the narrow staircase. The room was small and plain, with a single bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a window that looked out over the main street. Xavier set her belongings down carefully, then turned to leave. "Mr. Prescott," Penelope said, stopping him at the door. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Not many men would have taken that risk. Xavier looked at her for a long moment, and Penelope felt something pass between them, an understanding or connection she could not name. "I hope things work out for you, Miss Zimmerman, whatever you decide." After he left, Penelope sank onto the bed and pressed her hands to her face. She had come all this way, spent the last of her father's savings on the stage coach fare, and now she discovered that the man she was supposed to marry was penniless. But what choice did she have? She could not go back to St. Louis. Her father was counting on her. Perhaps it would not be so bad. Perhaps Jonathan was a good man, despite his financial situation. She spent the afternoon unpacking and trying to make herself presentable, washing the travel dust from her face and hands with the tepid water in the pitcher, and changing into her best dress, a blue cotton with white lace at the collar that had been her mother's before she died. As 6 o'clock approached, her stomach twisted with nervousness. Jonathan Whitmore was waiting in the hotel's small dining room when she came downstairs. He stood as she entered, and Penelope recognized him from the daguerreotype, though he was shorter than she had expected and softer around the middle. He had light brown hair receding at the temples and pale eyes that reminded her of weak tea. He was perhaps 30 years old, not handsome but not unpleasant to look at. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, taking her hand and bowing over it with exaggerated courtesy. "You are even lovelier than your photograph suggested. I am so pleased you have arrived safely." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," Penelope replied, allowing him to seat her at the table. The meal that followed was awkward and stilted. Jonathan talked almost nonstop about himself, about his position with the railroad, about the house where they would live, about his plans for the future. He asked her almost nothing about herself, and when she tried to speak, he interrupted with another story or observation. Penelope found herself comparing him unfavorably to Xavier Prescott, who had said little but whose few words had been genuine and thoughtful. "My uncle has been very generous," Jonathan was saying, cutting into his beefsteak with precise movements. "He has given me a wonderful opportunity with the railroad. Of course, he expects hard work and dedication, but that is only right. A man must earn his way in this world." "Do you earn a salary?" Penelope asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Jonathan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon. I only wondered about the practical arrangements," Penelope said, trying to sound casual. "My father would want to know that I will be provided for." "Of course you will be provided for," Jonathan said, a hint of irritation in his voice. "You will have everything you need. My uncle sees to that. But do you have money of your own, independent means?" Penelope pressed, watching his face carefully. Jonathan's expression turned cold. "What an indelicate question, Miss Zimmerman. I hardly think it appropriate for a lady to concern herself with financial matters. You should trust that your husband will care for you." "I would like to trust that," Penelope said softly, "but I would also like to understand the situation I am entering. I have heard that you are dependent on your uncle for everything." "Is that true?" Jonathan set down his fork with a sharp click. "Who told you that? Was it Prescott?" "That interfering cowboy has no business talking to you about my private affairs." "He was concerned for my welfare," Penelope said, feeling her own temper rise. "And I am grateful to him for his honesty. Why did you not tell me in your letters that you have no independent income?" "Because it is none of your concern," Jonathan snapped. "A wife's duty is to her husband, not to question his financial arrangements. I offered you marriage, Miss Zimmerman, not a business partnership. If you are too proud to accept what I am offering, perhaps you should have stayed in St. Louis." Penelope stood up abruptly, her napkin falling to the floor. "Perhaps I should have. Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore. I find I have lost my appetite." She walked out of the dining room with as much dignity as she could muster, aware of the other diners staring at her. Back in her room, she paced the small space, her mind racing. Jonathan had not denied it. He had no money of his own, and worse, he seemed to think it was not her right to know. What kind of marriage would that be, always at the mercy of his uncle's generosity, always dependent and powerless? But what choice did she have? She had no money to return to St. Louis, no prospects, no family except her failing father. Tears of frustration burned in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She was not the crying type. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Who is it?" "Xavier Prescott, madam." "I have something for you." Penelope opened the door cautiously. Xavier stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands again, looking uncertain. "I heard what happened at supper," he said quietly. "The whole hotel heard, to be honest. I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I am fine," Penelope said, though her voice shook slightly. "Just angry at myself for being so foolish." "You are not foolish," Xavier said firmly. "You were lied to, and that is not your fault." He hesitated, then held out a small leather pouch. "This is my wages from the past 6 months. It is enough for a stage coach ticket back to St. Louis and a bit more for expenses. I want you to take it." Penelope stared at the pouch, astonished. "I cannot take your money, Mr. Prescott. That is absurd." "It is not absurd. It is the right thing to do," Xavier insisted. "You came here in good faith, and you were deceived. I cannot let you marry that man out of desperation when I have the means to help you." "But why would you do this?" Penelope asked, bewildered. "You do not even know me." Xavier's dark eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that made her heart skip. "Maybe I would like to know you," he said quietly. "Maybe from the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, looking brave and scared at the same time, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Maybe I have been trying to talk myself out of feeling that way because you were supposed to marry my employer, but now that you know the truth, maybe there is a chance you might consider a different path." Penelope could not breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such raw honesty and feeling. "Mr. Prescott, Xavier," he interrupted. "My name is Xavier." "Xavier," she repeated, and the name felt good on her tongue. "I do not know what to say. This is all happening so fast." "I know," Xavier said. "And I am probably 10 kinds of fool for saying anything at all. But I could not let you leave without knowing that there is someone here who cares what happens to you. Someone who would like the chance to show you what a real marriage could be like, between equals who respect each other." Penelope looked down at the pouch in his outstretched hand, then back up at his face. He was nothing like she had imagined when she dreamed of her future husband. He was a cowboy, a ranch hand, a man who worked with his hands and probably did not have much more than what he was offering her right now. But there was something in his eyes, a kindness and strength that Jonathan Whitmore would never possess. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is all so much to take in." "Of course," Xavier said, lowering his hand but not quite withdrawing the offer. "I will be at the cattle pens tomorrow morning if you want to talk. But Miss Zimmerman, Penelope, if I may call you that, please do not marry Jonathan Whitmore. Whatever you decide about me, please do not tie yourself to a man who lied to you and thinks you have no right to the truth." After he left, Penelope sat on the bed holding the leather pouch. She opened it and counted $23, a small fortune for a working man. That Xavier would offer her everything he had, that he would risk his job and his future for a woman he had just met, told her more about his character than 100 letters could have done. She did not sleep well that night. The bed was uncomfortable, and her mind would not rest. She kept seeing Xavier's face, the way he looked at her, the sincerity in his voice. She thought about Jonathan's coldness, his dismissive attitude, his lies. She thought about her father and the burden she was supposed to lift from his shoulders. But mostly she thought about what kind of life she wanted, what kind of woman she wanted to be. When morning came, she dressed carefully and went downstairs to find breakfast. The dining room was nearly empty, just a few railroad workers hunched over plates of eggs and bacon. Penelope ate quickly, barely tasting the food, then stepped outside into the already warming day. She found her way to the cattle pens on the edge of town, following the noise and smell. Xavier was there, working with a half-dozen other cowboys to sort cattle for shipment. He wore leather chaps over his worn jeans and a bandana around his neck to keep the dust out. She watched him work for a few minutes, impressed by his easy competence, the way he handled the massive animals without fear. He spotted her and said something to another cowboy, then jogged over to the fence where she stood. "You came," he said, and she could hear the hope in his voice. "I wanted to talk to you," Penelope said. "Really talk, not just stand in a hotel hallway." Xavier glanced back at the pens, then made a decision. "Let me get cleaned up. There is a place we can go." 20 minutes later, they were walking along the bank of the Arkansas River, which ran shallow and sluggish through town this time of year. Cottonwood trees offered patches of shade, and the sound of the water was peaceful after the noise of the cattle pens. Xavier had washed his face and hands and removed his chaps, and now he walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, looking nervous. "Tell me about yourself," Penelope said. "I know almost nothing about you except that you are honest and generous to a fault." Xavier laughed, a warm sound that made her smile. "There is not much to tell. I grew up in Texas, near San Antonio. My parents had a small ranch, but they died of fever when I was 16. I have been working cattle ever since, moving from place to place, trying to save enough to start something of my own someday." "Do you have any family?" Penelope asked. "A sister in Dallas, married with 3 children. We write sometimes." Xavier kicked at a stone, sending it skittering toward the water. "What about you? How does a girl from St. Louis end up on a stagecoach to Colorado to marry a stranger?" Penelope told him about her father's failing business, about her mother's death 2 years earlier, about the weight of responsibility she felt to help her family the only way she knew how. Xavier listened without interrupting, his attention focused entirely on her in a way that made her feel valued and heard. "So you were trying to save your father," Xavier said when she finished. "That is brave, Penelope. Foolish maybe, but brave." "I am beginning to think it was more foolish than brave," Penelope admitted. "What kind of life would I have had with Jonathan? Always dependent on his uncle, always powerless. At least in St. Louis I have some measure of independence, even if we are poor." "Or you could stay here," Xavier said quietly. "Not with Jonathan, but with me, if you wanted to." Penelope stopped walking and turned to face him. "Xavier, we have known each other for less than 24 hours. How can you be sure about this?" "I cannot be completely sure," Xavier admitted. "But I know what I feel when I look at you. I know that I want the chance to make you happy, to build something real with you. I do not have much, Penelope. I have my wages, my saddle, my horse, and a dream of owning a piece of land someday. But I can promise you honesty and respect and hard work. I can promise that I will never lie to you or treat you as less than my equal." Penelope looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. It terrified her, this leap into the unknown with a man she barely knew, but it also thrilled her in a way that nothing ever had before. Jonathan Whitmore had been a safe choice, or so she had thought, a calculated decision based on practicality. Xavier Prescott was something else entirely, something wild and real and honest. "I need to think about this," she said again, but even as she said it, she knew her decision was already made. They walked back to town slowly, neither wanting the conversation to end. Xavier told her about his work, about the cattle drives he had been on, about the open range and the changing times as railroads and fences carved up the land. Penelope told him about her childhood, about her love of reading, about the small pleasures that had sustained her through hard times. When they reached the hotel, Marcus Whitmore was waiting on the front porch, his face purple with rage. "Prescott, what the hell do you think you are doing, walking around with my nephew's intended?" "I am not your nephew's intended," Penelope said before Xavier could respond. "I have decided not to marry him." Marcus sputtered, his eyes bulging. "You cannot just decide that. We have an agreement. I paid for your passage here. You did not pay for anything," Penelope said coldly, her fear evaporating in the face of his bluster. "My father paid my passage." "You have no claim on me. Please tell your nephew that I wish him well, but I will not be marrying him." "You will regret this," Marcus threatened. "Who do you think you are, you little nobody from nowhere? My nephew was doing you a favor offering to marry you." "If that is the kind of favor he offers, he can keep it," Penelope shot back. She turned to Xavier. "Will you help me get my things?" Xavier's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed with something like pride. "Yes, madam." They went upstairs together, leaving Marcus shouting threats on the porch. In her room, Penelope quickly packed her few belongings back into her carpetbag and trunk. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She felt exhilarated, terrified, and more alive than she had in years. "Where will you go?" Xavier asked quietly. "I do not know yet," Penelope admitted. "I cannot go back to St. Louis. Even with the money you offered, it would only delay the inevitable. My father cannot support me." "Then stay here," Xavier said. "Not in this hotel, but in La Junta. There are respectable boarding houses. You could find work, maybe teaching or sewing. Let me court you properly, the way a woman should be courted. Give us a chance to see if what we feel now is real." Penelope set down the dress she had been folding and looked at him. "You are serious about this?" "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," Xavier said. He crossed the small room to stand in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I know this is fast. I know it seems crazy. But sometimes you just know, Penelope. Sometimes you meet someone and everything just makes sense." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, then nodded. "All right, let us try this, but we do it properly like you said. I will not jump from one hasty marriage to another, even if my heart is telling me you are nothing like Jonathan Whitmore." The smile that broke across Xavier's face was like the sun coming out. "Thank you," he said simply. Getting Penelope moved into a boarding house proved easier than expected. Xavier knew of a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who ran a clean, respectable establishment 3 streets over from the hotel. She had a small room available on the 2nd floor, and when Xavier explained the situation, leaving out the more romantic details, Mrs. Henderson clucked sympathetically and offered a very reasonable rate. "Any woman with the courage to stand up to Marcus Whitmore is welcome in my house," the widow declared. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "That man has been a blight on this town for years." Penelope settled into the boarding house with relief. The room was small but clean, with a real window that let in light and air, and Mrs. Henderson provided breakfast and supper as part of the board. Best of all, she was kind without being intrusive, and she seemed to approve of Xavier's careful courtship, because Xavier did court her properly. He called on her every Sunday afternoon, always on time and always respectful. They walked together through town, attended church together, and sat on Mrs. Henderson's front porch in the evenings when his work allowed, talking about everything and nothing. Penelope found work doing alterations for the town's dressmaker, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Talbot who paid poorly but kept her busy. As the weeks passed, Penelope fell more deeply in love with Xavier. She loved his quiet strength, the way he treated everyone from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest cowboy with the same respect. She loved how he listened when she talked, really listened, and remembered the things she said. She loved the way his eyes lit up when he saw her, the way he said her name like it was something precious. Xavier had been fired from his job with Marcus Whitmore, as expected, but he found work quickly with another rancher, a fair-minded man named Tom Sullivan, who owned a spread about 5 miles outside town. The pay was decent, and Tom had hinted that there might be a chance for Xavier to buy into a partnership eventually if he proved himself. One Sunday in late October, as they walked along the river wrapped in jackets against the autumn chill, Xavier took Penelope's hand and stopped walking. The cottonwood trees had turned golden, and leaves drifted down around them like rain. "I love you," Xavier said, the words simple and direct. "I have loved you since that first day, and every day since has only made me more certain. I know we agreed to take this slow, but Penelope, I do not want to wait any more. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you. I love you too. I think I have loved you since you offered me everything you had to save me from a terrible mistake." Xavier pulled her into his arms and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Penelope felt like she had finally found her home. Not in a place, but in a person. They were married a month later in the small church in La Junta, with Mrs. Henderson and Tom Sullivan standing up for them. Penelope wore a new dress she had made herself, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and Xavier wore his best shirt and a new vest he had bought special for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Penelope knew she had made the right choice. Xavier had been saving every penny, and he had rented a small house on the edge of town for them to start their married life. It was modest, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Penelope made curtains for the windows and cooked their meals on the cast-iron stove, and Xavier came home every evening smelling of cattle and leather, his face lighting up when he saw her. Their first months of marriage were not without challenges. Money was tight, and they had to be careful with every dollar. The winter of 1878 was harsh, with bitter cold and heavy snow that made Xavier's work harder and less frequent. But they faced it together, huddled under quilts in their small bed, planning for the future. Penelope wrote to her father, confessing what had happened and introducing him to Xavier through carefully written pages. She sent what little money she could spare, and she received a letter back that both gladdened and saddened her heart. Her father wrote that he was proud of her for having the courage to choose her own path, that he had been wrong to push her toward marriage as a solution to their problems. He was managing, he said, though times were still hard, but knowing she was happy made everything easier to bear. In the spring of 1879, Tom Sullivan offered Xavier the partnership he had been hoping for. It required Xavier to invest his savings and take on more responsibility, but it also meant a real stake in something, a chance to build equity and security. Xavier and Penelope talked late into the night, weighing the risks and rewards, and finally decided to take the chance. That decision proved to be the right one. Sullivan was a good businessman and a better mentor, and under his guidance, Xavier learned not just cattle management but the business side of ranching. The partnership prospered, and within a year, they had expanded their operation and bought more land. Penelope's life changed too. She stopped doing alterations for Mrs. Talbot and instead started her own small business making dresses for the growing population of La Junta. Word spread about her skill with a needle, and soon she had more work than she could handle. She hired 2 local girls to help her, and together they turned out beautiful garments that rivaled anything that could be ordered from back east. In the summer of 1880, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She and Xavier had talked about children, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Xavier was thrilled, immediately beginning to plan additions to their house to make room for the baby. Their son was born in March of 1881, a healthy boy with Xavier's dark eyes and Penelope's auburn hair. They named him Thomas, after Tom Sullivan, who had become like family to them. Holding her son for the first time, Penelope thought about how different her life could have been if she had married Jonathan Whitmore, how empty and small. She felt nothing but gratitude for the cowboy who had told her the truth and given her a choice. Thomas was followed by a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Rose, and then another son, James, 2 years after that. Their little house grew with additions and renovations, expanding to accommodate their growing family. Xavier's partnership with Tom Sullivan continued to thrive, and eventually, Xavier bought out Tom's share when the older man decided to retire, making Xavier and Penelope the sole owners of what had become one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. The years passed in a blur of hard work, laughter, tears, and love. Penelope watched her children grow, teaching them to read and write, to work hard and be honest. Xavier taught Thomas and James to ride and rope, and he doted on Rose, who had her mother's independent spirit and wrapped her father around her little finger. They faced challenges, of course. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and market downturns. There were times when money was tight again, when they had to make hard choices and sacrifices. But they faced it all together, as partners, as equals, as the team they had promised to be. La Junta grew and changed around them. The railroad brought more people, more businesses, more opportunities. The wild edge of the town softened, became civilized. Penelope sometimes thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in 1878, so desperate and alone. She barely recognized that girl in the confident woman she had become. On a warm evening in August of 1895, Penelope and Xavier sat on the porch of their now substantial house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their children were grown now. Thomas was 24 and married, running the cattle operation with his father. Rose was 22 and teaching school in town, courting a nice young man who worked at the bank. James was 20 and helping his brother with the ranch while trying to decide what he wanted to do with his life. "Have I told you today that I love you?" Xavier asked, reaching over to take Penelope's hand. Penelope smiled, her heart as full as it had been 17 years ago when he first said those words. "You have, but I never tire of hearing it." "I was thinking about the day we met," Xavier said. "How scared I was to tell you the truth about Jonathan Whitmore. I almost did not do it. I almost just delivered you to that hotel and walked away." "Thank God you did not," Penelope said fervently. "Thank God you were brave enough to speak up." "I think about the life you would have had if you had married him," Xavier continued. "How miserable you would have been. It makes me angry even now." "Do not be angry," Penelope said, squeezing his hand. "Everything happened exactly as it was supposed to. I was supposed to come to La Junta. I was supposed to meet you. We were supposed to build this life together." Xavier pulled her close, and Penelope rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "I heard something in town yesterday," Xavier said after a while. "Jonathan Whitmore has died. Apparently, his uncle finally passed a few years ago, and without his support, Jonathan lost everything. He was living in a boarding house, drinking himself to death." Penelope felt a pang of sadness for the man who might have been her husband. "That is tragic. I cannot help but wonder if things could have been different for him if he had made better choices." "Maybe," Xavier said, "but some people never learn. I am just grateful every day that you did not tie yourself to him, that I found the courage to give you a choice." "We gave each other a choice," Penelope corrected. "I chose you just as much as you chose me, and it was the best decision I ever made." They sat together until the stars filled the sky. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built something real and lasting. Their love had not been instant or easy, but it had been honest and true, and that had made all the difference. Inside the house, they could hear sounds of their children moving about. Thomas and his wife had come for supper and stayed late, talking about plans for the ranch. Rose had stopped by with her young man, seeking her parents' blessing for their engagement. James was in the kitchen, probably raiding the pantry for a late-night snack. "We did well, did we not?" Xavier said quietly, "with all of this, with our life." "We did very well indeed," Penelope agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible when I stepped off that stagecoach 17 years ago, so scared and uncertain." "You were beautiful even then," Xavier said. "Brave and beautiful and worth every risk I took." Penelope lifted her face to kiss him, a kiss that held 17 years of love and partnership and devotion. When they finally pulled apart, she saw the same emotion reflected in his dark eyes that she felt in her own heart. They eventually went inside, locking up the house for the night and saying goodnight to their children. In their bedroom, the room they had shared for so many years, Xavier helped Penelope unpin her hair, running his fingers through the auburn strands that were now threaded with silver. "Still beautiful," he murmured, and Penelope laughed. "You are biased," she said, but she was pleased nonetheless. They lay together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been so many nights before. Penelope thought about all the nights to come, all the days they would spend together as they grew old. She thought about grandchildren they would spoil, about the ranch they would pass down to Thomas, about Rose's wedding and James's future. But mostly she thought about the cowboy who had risked everything to tell her the truth, who had seen her not as a convenience or a burden, but as a person worthy of honesty and respect. She thought about how one moment of courage, one decision to speak up, had changed both their lives forever. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Xavier asked, half asleep. "For saving me," Penelope said. "For giving me a choice, for loving me." Xavier pulled her closer. "Thank you for choosing me," he replied. "For taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but hope and honesty to offer." "You had more than that," Penelope said. "You had integrity and courage and the biggest heart I have ever known. That was more than enough." They fell asleep like that, holding each other close, two hearts beating in harmony. Outside, the Colorado night stretched wide and beautiful, full of stars and promise. Inside, a family slept peacefully, secure in the love that had built this home, this life, this future. The years continued to unfold with grace and joy. Xavier and Penelope watched their grandchildren be born and grow, passing on the stories of how they met, how a simple act of honesty had changed everything. They taught those grandchildren the values that had sustained them through good times and bad. Honesty, hard work, love, and the courage to speak truth even when it was difficult. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and when Xavier finally decided to retire fully in his 60s, he did so knowing that everything he and Penelope had built would continue. Rose married her banker and gave them 3 more grandchildren. And James eventually found his calling as a veterinarian, studying back east, and then returning to La Junta to set up practice. Penelope and Xavier grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like fine wine. They took long walks together every evening that weather permitted, hand in hand, talking about their day or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other completely. They traveled occasionally, taking the train to visit Rose and her family, or to see the ocean that neither of them had experienced before. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that brought tears to Penelope's eyes. The house was filled with family and friends, with laughter and music and love. As she stood next to Xavier, cutting the cake that Rose had made special for them, Penelope looked around at the life they had created and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Xavier took Penelope in his arms and danced with her in their parlor, humming a tune from their youth. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and thought about the young cowboy who had offered her everything he had, who had seen her worth when she could barely see it herself. "I would do it all again," Xavier said, as if reading her thoughts. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, I would do it all again just to end up here with you." "As would I," Penelope said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Oh, Xavier, as would I." They lived many more years together, growing into their 70s and watching their grandchildren have children of their own. Their love story became legend in La Junta, the tale of the woman who almost married the wrong man and the cowboy who told her the truth. Young couples would ask them for advice, and Xavier would always say the same thing: "Be honest, even when it is hard. Treat each other as equals. Choose love over convenience every single time." And Penelope would add, "Sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards." Do not be afraid to choose your own path, even if it is not the one others expect. When Xavier finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Penelope was holding his hand. She grieved deeply, as anyone would after losing their soulmate, but she was also grateful beyond measure for the 50 years they had shared. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on the stories and values that had defined her life. On her own deathbed, with her family gathered around her, Penelope's last words were about Xavier. "I see him," she whispered, her faded eyes brightening. "He is waiting for me, looking just like he did that first day, with his hat in his hands and hope in his eyes. I am coming, my love. I am coming home." And with that, Penelope Zimmerman Prescott closed her eyes for the last time, a smile on her lips, secure in the knowledge that she had lived a life full of love and meaning, all because a cowboy had been brave enough to tell her the truth before she made a mistake she could never undo. Their story lived on in La Junta for generations, a testament to the power of honesty, courage, and true love. The ranch they built still stood, passed down through the family, a lasting legacy of what 2 people could create when they chose each other freely and loved each other completely. And somewhere in the wide Colorado sky, 2 souls danced together, young again, bound forever by a love that had started with one moment of truth and grown into something eternal.